Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Skype sessions. And today I am joined by philosopher and theologian Kenneth Samples from Reasons to Believe. Kenneth, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Can you just introduce yourself to our viewers, just explain a little bit of who you are and what it is you do?
Yes, I presently work at Reasons to Believe. It's a science faith apologetic organization here in Southern California, USA. And I've worked here for about 25 years. Prior to that, I worked at the Christian Research Institute and used to host the program, The Bible Answer Man. And even though we're kind of science faith, I kind of bring the philosophy, theology side to various issues. And C.S. Lewis was he was the first Christian author I ever read back in 1978. Mere Christianity had a lifelong influence on me. So I've seen your podcast and I love it, and I'm very grateful to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you here because you wrote an article about two of my favorite people in the world. The first is fairly obvious, C.S. Lewis. And the second is someone that listeners will have heard us mention quite a few times on the show, particularly during the Great Divorce, and that's St. Augustine of Hippo, one of my favorite church fathers. So would you mind telling us what prompted you to write an article about these two men?
Yeah, I would say that I grew up as a Roman Catholic, kind of a nominal Catholic. Our family fell away from their kind of spiritual roots a little bit. Early in college, my sister gave me a copy of Mere Christianity, and that really led to my entire adult life being interested in C.S. Lewis, reading his works. But I was also looking for someone in Christendom that I thought would kind of represent, well, we might call it mere Christianity, more the idea than the book. But I see St. Augustine as that individual. He's in many ways kind of the father of Western Christendom. His books are, amazing. The Confessions has been a bestseller for so many years. And I saw Augustine kind of as the bridge between both Catholics and Protestants. And many people may not know, Augustine may have influenced Protestants nearly as much as he has Catholics. So both of them are kind of two people that I look to as kind of spiritual mentors, people who challenge me. And I've spent decades trying to read as much of them and about them as I possibly could.
And I would say for both of those authors, that is a lifetime's journey.
Indeed.
I remember when I discovered the Church Fathers and I started reading them, and I said to myself, I'm going to read all of them. And then I saw the volumes and volumes, and it's like, maybe just Augustine. Nope, that's not helping. Maybe just the Ante-Nicene Fathers. I was like, that's still not helping. There is so much.
Right.
And on our podcast, I have done the back of the napkin calculations. I think I can get through Lewis's corpus. If the Lord gives me reasonable life, hopefully before I go to meet Lewis, I'll have got through all of his works on the podcast. So here's to hoping.
Very good. Yeah.
Well,
Well, Augustine he wrote more than anybody in the ancient world, more than 5 million words. So he is, I'm making my way, but it's slow.
Yes, the thing that really opened up Augustine to me was, first of all, I read the Confessions, and I actually I was reading the book, but I then got the audiobook to read along with it, because I found it's a unique book in terms of it is a prayer, and that's kind of weird reading that. So it really helped having a voice actor in my head speak this as I was meant to read it. I found that really helpful to at least get going on the book. Yeah, no, it's a wonderful book. But what really helped me with Augustine was using the Catena Aurea. So this specifically the one that's put together by St. Thomas Aquinas, but there are others where it basically goes through the Gospels and you see what each of the fathers said about the particular verses in question. And I just consistently found that Augustine's commentary was just gold.
Yeah. Well, my last reading of the Confessions, I counted the number of biblical citations and references, and it was 600.
Dang.
So I think many people are not aware how people like Augustine and Aquinas, I think in many respects, they had they had the Bible virtually mastered. And so I'm not surprised that people like Augustine and Aquinas are not influential just for Catholics, but for Protestants.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, let's pivot and talk about your article. Your article is Reasons to Believe, and I'll put a link in the show notes. And it's entitled 12 Life Parallels Between St. Augustine and C.S. Lewis. So would you just mind walking us through some of these parallels so people can get an idea of what your article is about, and then they can go read it?
Sure. I found it interesting that they have so many things in common. One of them is in terms of their birth. Both of them are born in what I would call declining empires. Certainly Lewis is born when the English Empire is on the decline. He's born in Ireland, but St. Augustine is born in North Africa. He's born in a little city called Tagaste. His dates are 354 to 430. And he's born in late antiquity at a time when many Romans were thinking, you know, the Roman Empire was doing just fine until Christianity came along. Maybe the pagan gods are angry. Well, the City of God, which is one of St. Augustine's great works, is a response to that charge that, no, it's not the birth of Christianity that has brought difficulties to the Roman Empire. Rather, it is their commitment to unjust principles and ideas. So Augustine comes out of North Africa, and which at the time, of course, would be around the Mediterranean world there, was part of the Roman Empire. And so both of them are kind of outsiders, kind of looking in. And I found that intriguing that both of them would be have that kind of thing in common.
Hmm. And their parentage also had some parallels. I can't believe I didn't recognize this until I read your article.
It certainly does. Both of them have very influential mothers. Monica, of course, here in Los Angeles, we have Santa Monica, named after Augustine's mother. She's somewhat of a helicopter mother, if you will. She is very interested in her son. When he falls away from the faith, of course, the story is she goes to the bishop weeping and crying, and the response on the part of the bishop is, your son will return to the faith because God can't hear all of this sorrow without responding to it. But for both Lewis and Augustine, they had very important mothers. Certainly in Lewis's life, the death of his mother really kind of rocked his world. And I also thought it was interesting that both of them had distant fathers. Both of them had caring families, but we might say somewhat dysfunctional families. And so they were kind of at odds. And, you know, years ago, Paul Vitz wrote a book, The Faith of the Fatherless, exploring the psychological dynamic of how do we get our view of God as Father. Sometimes it's influenced by our human fathers. But it's interesting. Both of them were very close to their mothers, distant from their fathers.
Mm. That was similar with my own life as well. So I've always felt a closeness with Augustine with regards to the affection that he speaks of Monica. And aside from the passage where he speaks about God breaking into his life in the Confessions, my favorite parts are all the ones where he's talking about his mother. Even where he left her stranded and said, oh yeah, I'm going to be at this dock at this time. He wasn't there. He skipped the country.
That's right. Yeah. Well, it's also encouraging, I think, to those of us who, you know, all of us, I think, probably have family challenges, and to know that these two great Christian thinkers, you know, they were like everybody else in that kind of context.
Now, you mentioned that Augustine fell away from the faith, and that was true for Lewis as well. Although he was raised in the Church of Ireland, he rejected his childhood faith in his early teen years. What happened with Augustine?
Yeah, he is a very bright teenager, and he hangs out with his friends in the neighborhood. And there's one very powerful event that he speaks about in the Confessions, where him and his friends get together and they steal a bunch of pears. And the emphasis there is not so much that they stole pears, but he says later that there was just kind of an exhilaration in doing something illicit, engaging in something that was wrong. And that was kind of the beginning of him being distant from his mother. His mother catechized him when he was very young. As soon as he left home, and of course both parents thought our son has real brilliance, is going to make an impact on the world. But by the time that he went to Carthage, he really kind of fell into the Greco-Roman sensual lifestyle, and he kind of repudiated his early beliefs, and then even began to entertain the Manichaean group, which today we might call a cult, kind of a mixing of Christianity and Gnosticism and various ideas. And certainly with Lewis, the idea of falling away from the faith, again, his mother dying, his being distant from his father, and then having Kirkpatrick as his tutor, very secular orientation. Both of them fell away from what was very meaningful, I think, as young people.
I love his description of Kirkpatrick, saying that he was an atheistic Presbyterian, meaning that he wore his best suit for gardening on Sundays.
I love that. Yeah.
Now, Lewis was also incredibly sharp, and like Augustine, he pursued worldly success. And like Augustine, he also had some interesting issues with women. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that both of them, Augustine and Lewis, for a time in their life, lived with women whom they were not married to. With St. Augustine, when he gets to Carthage, he meets a young woman. They become lovers. They are never officially married, although by today's standards, it might be a civil type of marriage. Augustine has a child with this young woman. Interestingly, he never names her in the Confession or in his writings. They have a child together. When Augustine comes back to his faith and is baptized, his son is baptized with him. But, they have this long relationship. His mother's not crazy about it. She wants him, I think, to some extent, to marry somebody fitted more toward his kind of social or economic class. But of course, in the life of Lewis, Lewis has this relationship with Patty Moore, one of his friends that are killed in World War I. Apparently, they had some kind of agreement that if one died, the other would care for their parents. Of course, there are Lewis scholars who think that that maybe Lewis's early relationship with Mrs. Moore was of a sexual nature. But I think it's interesting that with both of them, they had these long period of being married to women, living with women whom they were not married. But of course, once they became a Christian, all of that changed. Their approach to their view of women, their approach to women, and their desire to please the Lord, I think, was in many ways extraordinary.
And they both did have very dramatic conversions, and not just conversions to a typical pew filler, but people who are really spokesmen for the faith.
Absolutely. There are some great conversions, of course, in Christianity, maybe the greatest, the Apostle Paul, but kind of my big three favorites in church history are Augustine, Pascal, and Lewis. And all of them have dramatic conversions. And I think what's interesting about their conversions, and here I'm speaking of Augustine and Lewis again, both of them, books play a significant role in their return to Christianity. Augustine is interested in Neoplatonic philosophy and the Enneads. He later actually reads a book written by St. Athanasius. Books influence him, but he builds a relationship with Ambrose, who later in church history is named as a doctor of the church, as St. Augustine is. So it's key people and key books. With Lewis, I think it's quite similar. There are books that play a very important role in his life. He mentions Chesterton, he mentions others, but then, of course, his friends and colleagues at Oxford University, Tolkien, and others play a significant role. And I've thought a lot about that. And I think maybe as I think about evangelism, as I think about sharing my faith, I know with people who have a real orientation toward learning, it is always people that play a role, but it's also the ideas that occupy people in terms of books.
Earlier in this season, I interviewed Mike Aquilina, an early church scholar, and he's actually got a book called The Friendship of the Fathers, where he specifically looks at basically that, about how the friendships played a role in the early church, and about how it was even really the main vehicle for evangelism.
Yeah, I think that's right on, and I think that I think as I want to be as a Christian, I want to do my part in sharing my faith with people, and I realize that as a Christian myself, I had to think through things. I needed somebody to point the way, and there were some very close friends that helped me toward my faith. But I also needed to wrestle with the books. I immediately recognized that my mind really mattered. And as I've studied the life of Augustine and Lewis, I see that they were thinking through issues with key books and key people.
Well, the Bible commands us to love God with our whole mind, soul, and strength. And well, how do you love God with your mind? How do you worship him with your mind? Part of it's learning more about him, and everything that you learn is another reason to love him.
That's right. Yeah. That's such a critical idea. And I think, within evangelicalism, I try to do my best to encourage people that part of loving God is loving him with that remarkable gift of the mind.
And loving the people who have loved him and seeing what they said about him. And
Indeed.
That really then takes us into the fact that they were both authors, and prolific authors, and authors of what are absolute Christian classics. If you put together a top 20 list of books that are read by Christians, you will find a lot of Augustine, you'll find a lot of Lewis.
Indeed. Lewis wrote, Augustine wrote 5 million words, approximately 5 million words. Some would say that makes him the most prolific author of antiquity. Lewis was the same kind of bookish person. A reader said that he could remember everything he read, which is utterly amazing. But these are individuals who write classic books. I mean, in the Great Books of the Western World, edited by Mortimer Adler, you have a number of Augustine's books. You have one of Lewis's books in there. So they were prolific authors, but they also wrote books, some that are very scholarly, some that critique worldview ideas, others that are popular in orientation. And so they were people, I think, who loved to write. They loved books. Of course, Augustine was living at a time where it's the kind of beginning of codices and books of that nature. But both of them are literary people. Amazingly, both were great speakers, both were great writers, both were passionate about their Christian faith. And again, for me, they just stand out as lights in the sky. They're so influential. And when I read the Confessions, I often think he's writing about me. That's my situation. Yeah. And Lewis also speaks to me that way. There are times in his writings where I think, wow, I can relate to that so much, so well.
Now, I mentioned that we've mentioned Augustine quite a few times on the show, particularly in The Great Divorce, when we've been describing Lewis's conception of evil is Augustine's conception of evil, that it isn't so much a thing, but a distortion, a twisting. And you see that idea shot through all of his works. But another common idea between them is that of desire, when we finished Till We Have Faces, and I hadn't read Till We Have Faces until we started doing it on the show. When we got to that final scene when Orwell is writing her final lines of her book, I told my co-host, this just sounds like the Confessions to me. You know, late have I loved you, beauty ever ancient, ever new. What is it about desire and these two men?
I think it's very, very powerful. Probably you could describe Augustine's statement. You know, Lord, you've created us for yourself. You've made us for yourself, and our hearts find no rest, no peace until we rest in you. That's kind of a thesis, I think, of the entire Confessions. And certainly with Lewis and his argument from desire, again, the idea, and it's powerful in St. Augustine, he thinks that part of the sinful condition is that we're disordered. We have disordered affections. We go looking for eternal satisfaction from temporal, finite things, and it doesn't satisfy. And I think of the world in which we live, where it is very common for people to look oftentimes good things, but even those temporal good things are not able to satisfy a person's existential longing and searching. And I love that in both Augustine and C.S. Lewis. When I was growing up, I felt restless. I felt like there's something that's missing and I can't quite put my finger on it. I thought, well, maybe it's meeting the right woman, or maybe it's having the successful career. And when you read that in St. Augustine, you read it in Lewis, you realize that we're made for God. And I love the quotation from Lewis where he talks about, you know, a car will only run on gasoline and nothing else. We're meant to run on the fuel of God. He's supposed to be what we're to burn in our life. And that is a theme. I mean, if somebody asked me to come and speak on a singular theme, I think that would be the theme that I would touch on, and I would quote both from Augustine and C.S. Lewis.
At the moment, we are having Apologetics Month on Pints with Jack, and we just did the argument from desire. And honestly, it's my favorite argument for God. I know it's not perhaps the strongest in terms of it can't compel, it can only appeal, but it's one that speaks very powerfully to me, because that was my experience. My adult conversion to the faith, when it really became my own, was when I opened up the first part of Jeremiah, and it said, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. I set you apart. I appointed you as prophet to the nations. You are mine. And I described it afterwards. It was like somebody had turned on a homing beacon inside of me. I suddenly recognized my need and at least had an inclination of the direction I needed to go in order to for that to at least be preliminarily satisfied.
Yeah, that searching sense. I had the same kind of experience, and in reading these two individuals, I felt like I belonged, I fit. They're describing things that are true of me, and that was very encouraging. Yeah.
But both men suffered in their lives. We've mentioned a few of them already, and because of their intellect, they had to square that with their worldview, and they both brought different solutions and different ideas to this concept of suffering and how it related to God.
They really did. Both of them had to confront kind of a secularism, a skepticism of their time. When Augustine leaves Manichaeanism, he begins to think maybe there are no ultimate answers, and it adopts a type of skepticism. And certainly Lewis experienced that early on. And the problem of pain, suffering, and evil. Augustine is well known for the idea that evil is not a thing. It's not a substance. It's not as if God would have created a particular thing. But there is an absence within it, kind of like a cavity in the tooth. There's an absence of enamel in that kind of context. And Augustine goes on to develop particular theodicies in thinking that through. C.S. Lewis, the same. If you read The Problem of Pain and then later compare it to A Grief Observed, you get kind of two sides, kind of bookends of the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. I think it's interesting that here are two men maybe separated by 1,500 years, but they're still engaging in the same kinds of challenges. And the problem of evil, pain, and suffering, I think, is a perennial challenge to anybody who believes that God is all powerful and all knowing and all good. And I like what they do. There are limitations to any theodicy, but I find both of them. And of course, when I first read Grief Observed, I was like, wow, this is such honesty, such candor. And, it's a painful thing to lose the people we love.
And he's like Augustine in that regard. I've heard people compare Augustine and Aquinas head and heart. So Augustine is the fiery heart, which you always see in portraits of him. He's usually holding this flaming heart in his hand. And you see that idea come across in Lewis as well. I remember when I read A Grief Observed, I knew I was in for something, and I sort of like took a breath and then started reading. But to sort of wrap everything up, you point out at the end of your article that they are universal Christian voices. This past month, we had Ecumenical Month. So I spoke to a Presbyterian, a Baptist, Eastern Orthodox, an Orthodox Jew about Lewis. And everybody loves him. Why do you think that is?
That's an amazing thing. I mean, I think Augustine is the bridge between Catholics and Protestants, but Augustine's not well appreciated in the East among the Orthodox tradition. They tend to view him as a bit pessimistic with his views of original sin. Lewis is a phenomenon to me. I mean, Walter Hooper said in having a audience with Pope John Paul II that the Pope kind of essentially said, I'm a C.S. Lewis fan. And he said, interestingly enough, John Paul said that the Four Loves is written at the level of St. Augustine. And I thought, wow, I love that kind of thing. It's interesting to me. My Reformed friends, there are many of them that like Augustine. I have the Wesleyan friends. They like Augustine. Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox. And I think one of the things that attracts me to both of the individuals is the idea of mere Christianity is very important to me. I mean, I want to contend for the truth, but I also want to promote unity, and hopefully I want to practice charity. And I find that in both of those individuals. They to me kind of bring Christianity together. And I think they are. And it's very difficult to find what I would call a universal Christian voice. Maybe the only other person that I would put into that too would be Athanasius, who is regarded so highly, not only by Orthodox, even Coptics, but Catholics and Protestants as well.
Next season, we're going to do Jack's Bookshelf, where we're going to go through, we'll be interviewing experts, and we're going to literally look at C.S. Lewis's bookshelf, and different guests are going to explain why this person is important and how they affected Lewis. And I'm already got Athanasius on that list. Well, I said that was the last question, but I actually have another one, because both men also have movies about them. We recently had The Most Reluctant Convert with C.S. Lewis, and before that there was an Augustine movie called The Restless Heart. Have you seen them?
Yes, I have. I've seen both of them, and I really like both films. A Restless Heart is a great film for contemporary people who maybe kind of wrestle placing Augustine in an appropriate historical context. I think the movie does that very, very well. And there are scenes, one time in The Restless Heart, Augustine is engaged with a particular group in North Africa, and he gives a message. He gives a statement about him and his need for God, and it's just gripping. And having seen the latest Lewis film, I was just I thought it was such an amazing thing to go out to a movie on a big screen and see a life of a historic Christian leader depicted. And so I like to write about movies that make you think, and those two are always on my list. I would encourage people maybe who haven't read much of Lewis or of Augustine, maybe you might want to start with those movies. They might fire you up to go to the bookshelf and read.
And if you do watch them, you'll actually hear a lot of their original words, because you have the Confessions in Restless Heart, and you certainly have an awful lot of Surprised by Joy, God in the Dock, in The Most Reluctant Convert.
Yes. Yeah. Wonderful. I felt grateful to be able to watch films like that. Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, where can people go to find the article? Where can they go to find out more about you?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. This has been so much fun just to talk about Augustine and Lewis. People can reach me at reasons.org. I have the article here. Let me grab the title for it. 12 Life Parallels Between St. Augustine and C.S. Lewis. So at reasons.org, just type in Ken Samples and all of that material will pop up for you.
And as I said, I will have links to all this in the show notes. Kenneth Samples, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Keep up the good work. I love your show.
Thank you. And viewers, please join us next time when we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.